Following the primeval history in Genesis 1 through 11, we enter a portion of the biblical narrative that focuses on the people that we know as the patriarchs. The stories of the patriarchs, they're found in the second of the two main sections of the book of Genesis in chapters 12 through 50. The patriarchs, this is the story of the birth of the nation of Israel, ultimately the beginning of the people of God. Now, there are three biblical patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when you read through the rest of Scripture, you'll find reference to these three individuals. God frequently identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, Genesis 12 through 50, a large portion of it actually focuses on Joseph. So we'll discuss him just briefly, but he's not actually one of the patriarchs, but we will just briefly mention his role in this video. Now, following the third and final crisis of the primeval history, we refer to as the Tower of Babel incident, we have a genealogy that leads us to Abram. And we read that Abram's family left Ur of the Chaldees. There is some debate on the location of this city. And so I have that both reflected on this map. Many people think it was a southern Mesopotamian location. And so that's down there at the bottom of the map, and they would have gone up. It says that they settled in Haran when they were on their way to Canaan. Some people doubt this because if you were to go to Canaan from Ur in southern Mesopotamia, then you would have not gone through Haran. Haran would have actually been quite far out of the way. And so some people think that maybe there is a northern location, and there's a city known as Ur that would have been north of Haran. And that could be another possible location. But I don't know if we really can conclude that matter. But in any event, Abram at this point does leave from Haran, and he goes and enters Canaan. Now, Abraham's story, and again, at this point, he's Abram. Later, he is renamed Abraham. It really begins with a command and a promise that God gives him. Now, the command is straightforward. Abram and all of his family are commanded to leave the city of Haran and go into the land that God will show him. Now, there's four major aspects of this command/promise. We see, of course, God is he wants to take him to a land. He's going to make him into a nation. Abraham is going to be blessed, but then also he is going to be a blessing through him to all people. These promises are foundational for Israel's own self-identity. They are going to be a nation uniquely blessed by God, and just as importantly, will be used as an instrument to bring God's blessing to all peoples. And when we read about this, God blessing all peoples through Abram's family, we're reminded, I think, of the scattering of people that just happened in the Tower of Babel in the last chapter. So this is just building right off of that. Abram's response, in the very next verse, in Genesis 12 and verse 4, we read that Abram went as the Lord had spoken to him. So we begin to see Abram's response, and then through that, God fulfilling his word to him. Abram travels into Canaan, and he begins to worship God in the land. And once he's in the land of Canaan, God clarifies that was the land specifically. In the previous few verses, God just says, "Go to the land that I will show you." And now that he's in Canaan, God clarifies that it's that land specifically that God was promising to Abram and to his descendants. Now, there are a lot of stories and really colorful illustrations of just of the patriarchs and their experiences with God. We're just going to focus on one central idea of the patriarchal narratives, and it's this concept of covenant. Now, we've learned a lot about covenants from the ancient world, not just from the Bible, but how it was used throughout the biblical world. A covenant was a type of treaty that was very well attested for a long time. Covenants were often given, when we say treaty, we might think of like modern treaties, which tend to be rather impersonal documents between two nations. Covenants in the ancient world were actually much more built on a personal relationship between two kings who were entering into this treaty with one another. They included stipulations, rules, or laws, things that a vassal might have to follow, laws that he was being imposed upon him. Also would typically include blessings or curses, that if you follow the stipulations, you will be blessed in such and such a way. And if you don't follow the stipulations or the rules, you'll be cursed or punished in another way. This is just a very cursory introduction to this concept of covenant, but we see this reflected in the Biblical Patriarchs. So what we call the Abrahamic covenant, we really find this in two main places in Genesis, in chapters 15 and 17. I would actually describe chapter 17 as a reaffirmation of the same covenant that God made with Abram in chapter 15. I think it's kind of the same. There's one Abrahamic covenant. We get it in chapter 15, and then reaffirmed, and some more details are given in chapter 17. A few highlights from these two chapters, though. We see that God is promising Abraham that he would have descendants that are like the stars. He also gives the prediction that these descendants will be enslaved, and subsequently they will be freed. We also get this land of Canaan, once again, promised to Abraham. This is where we see his name changed, Abram to Abraham, and his wife Sarai, her name is changed to Sarah. Circumcision is given as the sign of the covenant. And then also it's clarified that it is specifically through their son Isaac. That's the promised son of the covenant. That's how God is going to make him a nation. Now, this is a cursory overview, so we're not getting into the details of all the wonderful stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Just tracing this theme of covenant. Covenant is typically something that is renewed from one generation to the next. And that's what we see with Isaac. Isaac receives relatively little attention in Genesis when you compare to the amount of material that we have about Abraham and the amount of material we have about Jacob and Joseph later. Isaac is, he's a relatively minor player, but he's very important, and we can trace this important theme of covenant through his life. And God's covenant with Abraham, it is renewed with Isaac. And note specifically that the promise is repeated that God will give to Isaac descendants that are like the stars. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. And then also note that it is the promise is reaffirmed here that it is through his descendants that all nations are going to be blessed. So those two specific things are highlighted for us, and we should take note of that as being very central to this whole idea of covenant and what God is wanting to do through Abraham and his descendants. Just like we see with Isaac, the covenant is renewed with Jacob. Quite a bit more material on Jacob, but again, we're just focusing on this theme of covenant, and I'm just pulling out one specific text. Again, you see this promise of numerous descendants, and this time it says, your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth. So immeasurable, innumerable. You can't count them. There's so many of them. And likewise, again, the promise that God will bless all families of the earth through his descendants. This is repeated again here in this one, in his renewal with Jacob. Now, it is through Jacob that we get the so-called tribes of Israel. Jacob has children through 4 women, Rachel and Leah. These are the 2 sisters, and through their servants, Zilpah and Bilhah, he has all of these descendants. Now, note 2 of the tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, are actually the sons of Joseph. So they get those. When we think of what are the tribes of Israel, these are the tribes of Israel. This is the full list, and we'll see how different land is allotted to each one. Of course, with Levi, there's going to be a bit of an exception on how that plays out. But it is through Jacob, we begin to see the fulfillment of God's promise to make Abraham into a nation. He's going to make a great nation out of him. And now there's only been one descendant for each generation, but now we see it mushrooming and blossoming out into these 12. 12, then Joseph is further divided into 2. Now, Joseph's story, we're not going to get into the details of it, but just to note the general arc. The story is very colorful, but he goes from being the favorite son of Jacob to being sold into slavery. He ends up in prison, and then finally he ends up serving in Pharaoh's house in a position of very considerable authority. And then a famine brings us to the conclusion of Joseph's story, and we're left in suspense because we find that the offspring of the patriarchs, when we get to the end of the patriarchal narratives, we find them in Egypt. But of course, we know that God has promised that they would be a great nation in the land of Canaan. And so it is the next chapter in our overview of the historical arc, the narrative arc of Israel's history, that we see how God brings his people out from Egypt and into the land of Canaan.